In the ancient city of Athens, where philosophers gathered in the agora to debate the nature of existence and merchants haggled over olive oil and pottery, there lived a man named Marcus who understood something that eluded even the wisest of his contemporaries. While others filled the air with endless words, seeking to prove their intelligence through elaborate speeches and public displays of knowledge, Marcus had discovered a profound truth. The greatest power often lay not in what one said, but in what one chose not to say. Marcus was not born into this understanding. Like many young men of his time, he had once been eager to prove himself, quick to speak, and desperate for recognition. He would engage in heated debates in the public squares, always ready with a clever retort or a cutting remark. His voice was among the loudest, his opinions the most forcefully expressed. Yet despite all his verbal prowess, he found himself consistently outmaneuvered by those who seemed to do far less talking. The transformation began on a particularly humid afternoon, when Marcus witnessed an encounter between two merchants in the marketplace. The first merchant, Dionysus, was known throughout Athens for his booming voice and theatrical gestures. He could sell sand to a desert dweller, people said, such was his gift for persuasion. The second merchant, an elderly man named Sophron, rarely spoke above a whisper, and was so unassuming that many visitors to the marketplace failed to notice his small stall tucked between the more elaborate displays of his competitors. On this day, both merchants were vying for the attention of a wealthy Roman trader who had come to Athens seeking the finest goods to transport back to Rome. Dionysus immediately launched into an elaborate presentation, gesturing wildly as he described the superior quality of his wares, the exotic origins of his spices, and the countless satisfied customers who had praised his merchandise throughout the known world. His voice carried across the marketplace, drawing curious onlookers who gathered to witness what promised to be an impressive sales performance. Meanwhile, Sophron simply stood quietly beside his modest display, occasionally adjusting the position of a ceramic vessel or smoothing the fabric of a hanging tapestry. When the Roman trader finally approached him, Sophron merely nodded respectfully and waited. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by Dionysus's continued proclamations from across the way. The Roman, accustomed to the aggressive tactics of merchants in his homeland, seemed puzzled by Sophron's restraint. "Have you nothing to say about your goods?" the Roman asked. Sophron smiled slightly and picked up a small bronze figurine. Turning it slowly in the sunlight so that its craftsmanship became apparent, he set it down gently and then selected a piece of silk, allowing the Roman to feel its texture between his fingers. Still, he said nothing. The Roman examined item after item, and with each piece, Sophron's quiet confidence seemed to communicate volumes. The quality spoke for itself. The workmanship was evident. The value was clear, without need for explanation or exaggeration. When the Roman finally made his selection, choosing exclusively from Sophron's stall, Marcus realized he had witnessed something profound. Dionysus had filled the air with words, promises, and claims, yet his very eagerness had created doubt in the Roman's mind. If the goods were truly as exceptional as claimed, why did they require such forceful selling? Sophron's silence, by contrast, had conveyed absolute confidence in his merchandise. His restraint suggested that the quality was so evident that words would only diminish it. From that day forward, Marcus began to study the power of strategic silence with the same intensity that others devoted to rhetoric and debate. He observed how the most successful generals in the Greek armies were often those who spoke little during war councils, but whose rare words carried tremendous weight when finally offered. He noticed how the wisest judges in the courts of Athens would listen to lengthy arguments from both sides before delivering verdicts that were remarkable for their brevity and clarity. Marcus began to understand that silence was not merely the absence of speech, but a sophisticated tool that could be deployed with surgical precision to achieve specific outcomes. He learned to distinguish between the silence of ignorance and the silence of wisdom, between the quiet of the defeated and the stillness of the strategically minded. Most importantly, he began to recognize that mastering silence required first mastering oneself. The journey toward this self-mastery became Marcus's primary focus. He realized that his previous eagerness to speak, to prove himself, to be heard above others, had stemmed from deep-seated insecurities and fears. The weak self within him craved constant validation, needed to be right in every argument, and sought to impress others through displays of knowledge and wit. This weak self was precisely what made him vulnerable to manipulation by others who understood how to exploit these needs. Marcus began the deliberate work of identifying and dismantling these weaknesses. He started by observing his own impulses during conversations. When someone made a statement he disagreed with, His first instinct was to immediately contradict them. Now, he forced himself to pause and consider. Was his disagreement based on genuine conviction or merely the ego's need to assert itself? Was his correction necessary for the advancement of truth, or was it simply an attempt to demonstrate his own knowledge? Through this self-examination, Marcus discovered that the vast majority of his verbal interventions served no purpose other than feeding his own sense of importance. The realization was both humbling and liberating. If he could eliminate these unnecessary displays of ego, he would not only conserve his mental and emotional energy, but also create space for more strategic communication. The process of destroying his weak self required Marcus to confront some uncomfortable truths about his motivations and desires. He had to acknowledge that much of his previous behavior had been driven by fear. Fear of being overlooked, fear of being considered ignorant, fear of losing face in public. These fears had made him predictable and therefore manipulable. Anyone who understood his need for recognition could easily control his behavior by either offering praise or threatening embarrassment. Marcus realized that as long as he remained attached to others' opinions of him, he would never be truly free to act according to his own judgment. The weak self was always looking outward for validation, approval, and recognition. It was this external dependence that created vulnerability. If someone else controlled the source of what the weak self craved, they effectively controlled the person. To break this dependence, Marcus began practicing what he called strategic detachment. This did not mean becoming cold or uncaring toward others, but rather developing an internal sense of worth that was independent of external validation. He started by deliberately seeking out situations where he could practice being overlooked or ignored without feeling the need to reassert himself. In the public baths, where men typically engaged in competitive discussions about politics and philosophy, Marcus would sit quietly and listen. When others tried to draw him into debates, he would simply smile and indicate his contentment to hear their views. Initially, this felt like defeat to his ego, but gradually he began to appreciate the wealth of information that became available when he wasn't focused on formulating his own responses. He discovered that people revealed far more about their true thoughts, motivations, and vulnerabilities when they believed they were speaking to someone who posed no intellectual threat. Men who would never have shared strategic information with a perceived competitor spoke freely in front of someone they regarded as merely a quiet listener. Marcus began to accumulate a vast understanding of the political undercurrents in Athens, the business dealings of prominent citizens, and the personal conflicts that shaped public affairs, all simply by being present and silent. This intelligence gathering was not pursued for malicious purposes, but rather as part of Marcus's growing understanding of human nature and social dynamics. He began to see patterns in how people behaved, what motivated their decisions, and how power actually moved through society. Most importantly, he recognized that those who talked the most usually knew the least about what was really happening, while those who listened carefully often possessed the most accurate understanding of any situation. As Marcus's practice of strategic silence deepened, he noticed that his relationship with conflict began to change. Previously, any challenge to his opinions or any slight to his reputation would trigger an immediate and often emotional response. He would argue passionately, sometimes saying things he later regretted, and frequently escalating minor disagreements into significant conflicts. Now, when faced with provocation, he would pause and consider whether any response was truly necessary. He learned to distinguish between attacks that required a response and those that were best ignored. Personal insults from those whose opinions carried no weight could be dismissed without acknowledgement. Challenges to his competence in areas where his reputation mattered might require a measured response, but not an immediate one. By taking time to consider his options, Marcus found that he could often craft responses that were far more effective than anything he might have said in the heat of the moment. More often than not, he discovered that saying nothing at all was the most powerful response. When someone attacked him publicly, expecting an angry rebuttal that would justify their aggression, his silence often left them looking foolish and petty. Their words would hang in the air, unanswered and therefore more revealing of their own character than of any supposed failings on Marcus's part. This approach required tremendous self-discipline. The weak self wanted to defend, to justify, to strike back. It craved the immediate satisfaction of a clever comeback or a devastating counterattack. But Marcus had learned that these immediate satisfactions often came at the cost of long-term strategic advantage. By remaining silent, he preserved his energy for battles that truly mattered while allowing his opponents to exhaust themselves in pointless aggression. The destruction of his weak self was not a single dramatic event, but rather a gradual process of recognizing and eliminating the patterns of thought and behavior that made him vulnerable. Each time he caught himself about to speak from ego rather than wisdom, each time he chose patience over immediate gratification, each time he prioritized long-term strategy over short-term validation, he weakened the hold that his lesser impulses had over his actions. As this internal transformation progressed, Marcus began to notice that others treated him differently. Where once he had been seen as just another voice in the crowd, now his rare words carried unusual weight. When he finally chose to speak on a matter, people listened with attention that they had never paid to his previous constant commentary. His opinions were sought out rather than simply offered, and his counsel was valued precisely because it was not freely given. The paradox was remarkable. By speaking less, he had become more influential. By seeking less attention, he had gained more respect. By caring less about others' immediate opinions of him, he had earned their deeper consideration. The weak self that had once demanded constant validation had been replaced by a stronger version that generated its own sense of worth and therefore attracted genuine respect from others. Marcus began to understand that this principle extended far beyond personal interactions into every aspect of life. In business dealings, the person who was most eager to close a deal usually ended up with the worst terms. The merchant who seemed indifferent to whether a customer bought from him or not could command higher prices than one who appeared desperate for the sale. In negotiations, the party that showed the least need for agreement often secured the most favorable outcome. This was not about manipulation or deceit, but rather about operating from a position of genuine strength and independence. When someone was truly willing to walk away from a poor deal, their negotiating position was automatically enhanced. When they genuinely did not need others' approval, they naturally commanded more respect. The key was ensuring that this indifference was authentic rather than performed. People could usually sense the difference between genuine confidence and mere posturing. Marcus applied these insights to his professional life with remarkable results. As a trader in fine goods, he had previously been eager to please every customer, quick to offer discounts, and anxious to close every possible sale. Now he adopted Safran's approach of quiet confidence. He selected his merchandise carefully, displayed it simply, and waited for customers to recognize its value. When they attempted to negotiate aggressively, he would listen politely but rarely made significant concessions. The results were initially surprising, then increasingly impressive. His profit margins improved substantially as customers began to view his reluctance to discount as evidence of his goods' superior quality. Wealthy buyers, accustomed to merchants who fawned over them, were intrigued by his respectful but independent manner. Word began to spread that Marcus dealt only in the finest goods and was selective about his customers. This reputation attracted exactly the kind of clientele he most wanted to serve. The transformation in his business success was merely a reflection of the deeper changes in his character. By destroying the weak self that had been driven by neediness and insecurity, Marcus had become genuinely attractive to others. People are naturally drawn to those who seem complete in themselves, who do not require external validation to feel valuable, who offer their attention and respect as gifts rather than desperate attempts to be liked. As news of Marcus's success spread through Athens, many sought to understand his methods. Some attempted to copy his silent approach without understanding its foundation and genuine self-transformation. These imitators failed because they were still operating from the weak self, merely adding a layer of tactical silence over their unchanged neediness and insecurity. Their silence felt artificial and manipulative rather than confident and strategic. Marcus recognized that the external practices, the strategic pauses, the careful listening, the measured responses, were merely expressions of internal changes. Without the underlying transformation of character, these techniques became hollow performance art that others could easily see through. The real power came not from the silence itself, but from the strength of character that made such silence possible. This understanding led Marcus to the second phase of his development, learning to read and influence others through strategic action and inaction. Having mastered his own impulses and reactions, he was now free to observe others with clarity and respond to them with intention rather than mere reaction. He began to study the patterns of weakness in others that he had once recognized in himself. He could identify the insecure person by their need to constantly prove themselves. He could spot the fearful individual by their tendency to overcompensate with aggression or boastfulness. He could recognize the desperate by their eagerness to please and their willingness to accept unfavorable terms just to avoid rejection. Most importantly, Marcus learned to distinguish between those who were operating from strength and those who were merely performing strength. Genuine strength was characterized by calmness, consistency, and the ability to remain centered regardless of external pressures. Performed strength, by contrast, was marked by the need to constantly demonstrate dominance, the tendency to overreact to challenges, and the underlying anxiety that appeared whenever the performance was questioned. This ability to read others accurately gave Marcus tremendous advantages in all his dealings. In business negotiations, he could sense when the other party was bluffing and when they were genuinely prepared to walk away. In social situations, he could identify who held real influence versus who merely occupied impressive titles. In conflicts, he could distinguish between opponents who were genuinely dangerous and those who were simply making noise to cover their own insecurity. Marcus developed what he called strategic responsiveness, the ability to give each person and situation exactly the type of energy that would produce the desired outcome. With insecure individuals who craved validation, he learned to offer just enough recognition to keep them cooperative without feeding their neediness to the point where they became dependent or demanding. With aggressive personalities who interpreted kindness as weakness, he maintained a respectful but firm boundary that earned their respect without escalating to unnecessary conflict. The key insight was that different people required different approaches, and the most effective strategy was often counterintuitive. The person who seemed most confident might actually be the most insecure, and therefore the most easily influenced through subtle challenges to their self-image. The individual who appeared weak might possess hidden reserves of strength that would emerge if they were treated with unexpected respect and consideration. Marcus learned to test these hypotheses through small, low-risk interactions before committing to any major strategy. He would observe how someone responded to brief periods of silence in conversation, how they reacted when their opinions were neither agreed with nor contradicted but simply acknowledged, how they behaved when they were neither praised nor criticized but treated with neutral respect. These tests revealed volumes about people's true character and motivations. The genuinely confident person remained unchanged, regardless of how they were treated, while the insecure individual would immediately begin working to elicit a more favorable response. The naturally honest person would maintain consistency in their statements and behavior, while those with hidden agendas would reveal inconsistencies when subjected to patient observation. Through this careful study of human nature, Marcus developed an almost supernatural ability to predict how people would behave in various situations. This was not mysticism, but rather the natural result of patient observation combined with deep understanding of the patterns that drove human behavior. When you understood what someone truly wanted, not what they claimed to want, but what their actions revealed they were seeking, you could anticipate their responses to different circumstances with remarkable accuracy. This predictive ability became one of Marcus's greatest assets. In the volatile world of ancient commerce, where fortunes could be made or lost based on accurately reading the intentions of partners, competitors, and customers, his insights proved invaluable. He could sense when a business associate was planning to break their agreement before they had fully formed the intention themselves. He could identify which potential partners were genuinely committed to mutual success versus those who were seeking to exploit any relationship for short-term gain. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus learned to use his strategic understanding to help others achieve their genuine goals while also advancing his own interests. This was not manipulation in the negative sense, but rather a sophisticated form of alignment that created value for all parties involved. For example, when dealing with someone whose aggressive negotiating style masked deep insecurity about their business acumen, Marcus would structure deals in ways that allowed them to feel they had won on visible terms while ensuring that the substantial advantages flowed to himself through less obvious channels. The other party would leave the negotiation feeling successful and respected, while Marcus would have achieved his primary objectives. Both sides were satisfied because the agreement addressed their real needs, even if those needs were not identical to their stated positions. This approach required Marcus to think several moves ahead, like a master chess player who considers not just the immediate consequences of each move, but how it would influence the entire trajectory of the game. He learned to plant seeds of ideas that would grow in others' minds until they believed these thoughts were their own insights. He developed the ability to guide conversations so subtly that others never realized they were being led toward particular conclusions. The sophistication of this approach lay in its respect for others' autonomy and dignity. Rather than trying to force people to act against their own interests or better judgment, Marcus found ways to align his goals with theirs so that their natural self-interest would lead them toward outcomes that benefited everyone involved. This created sustainable relationships based on mutual advantage rather than exploitation of temporary weakness or advantage. As Marcus's reputation for wisdom and success grew throughout Athens, he began to attract attention from some of the city's most prominent citizens. Politicians sought his counsel on matters of public policy, wealthy merchants requested his partnership in major ventures, and philosophers invited him to participate in their discussions of ethics and governance. Yet even as his influence expanded, Marcus remained committed to the principles that had brought him to this position. He continued to speak sparingly, choosing his words with the same care that a skilled archer chose his targets. He maintained his practice of listening more than talking, of observing more than performing. Most importantly, he never allowed success to resurrect the weak self that he had worked so hard to destroy. The temptations were constant, opportunities to show off his knowledge, chances to dominate conversations through the force of his reputation, invitations to indulge in the ego-feeding activities that he had once craved. But Marcus had learned that strength was not a permanent achievement, but rather an ongoing practice. Each day brought new challenges to his self-discipline, new tests of his commitment to operating from wisdom rather than ego. The difference now was that he recognized these challenges for what they were and had developed the tools to meet them successfully. The true test of his transformation came when Marcus faced his first serious crisis since beginning his journey of self-mastery. A competitor, jealous of Marcus's growing success and frustrated by his inability to provoke the kind of public conflict that might damage Marcus's reputation, began spreading false rumors about the quality of his goods and the honesty of his business practices. In his former life, Marcus would have immediately launched a vigorous public defense, perhaps even going on the offensive against his accuser. He would have marshaled evidence, demanded public hearings, and worked to destroy his opponent's credibility as thoroughly as his own was being attacked. The weak self would have been outraged at the injustice and desperate to restore his damaged reputation as quickly as possible. Instead, Marcus chose a radically different approach. He continued conducting his business exactly as he always had, with the same attention to quality and the same respectful treatment of customers. When people asked him directly about the rumors, he would acknowledge that he was aware of them, but declined to engage in public debates about his competitors' motivations or character. He simply invited anyone with concerns to examine his goods and judge for themselves. This response confused and frustrated his opponent, who had expected a heated public battle that would give credibility to his accusations. When Marcus refused to engage, the competitor was forced to escalate his attacks, making increasingly wild claims that began to sound desperate and vindictive rather than credible. Meanwhile, Marcus's loyal customers and business associates rallied to his defense without any prompting from him. They had direct experience of his integrity and the quality of his goods, and they began to speak out against what they saw as unfair and baseless attacks. Because these defenses came from independent sources rather than from Marcus himself, they carried far more credibility than anything he might have said on his own behalf. Within a few months, the controversy had blown over completely. Marcus's reputation emerged stronger than before, enhanced by the contrast between his dignified restraint and his competitor's increasingly erratic behavior. The competitor, having exhausted his credibility through overreaching attacks, found his own business suffering as customers questioned the judgment and character of someone who would engage in such tactics. The incident became a defining moment in Marcus's understanding of how strategic silence and self-mastery could transform even apparent defeats into victories. By refusing to be drawn into his opponent's preferred battlefield, public confrontation and character assassination, he had forced the conflict onto terrain where his strengths could prevail: consistency, quality, and the respect of those who knew his work directly. This experience taught Marcus that the person who could not be provoked into destructive reactions held a tremendous advantage over those who relied on emotional manipulation to achieve their goals. His competitor had essentially defeated himself by pursuing a strategy that required Marcus to cooperate through angry responses and defensive behaviors. When that cooperation was withheld, the entire attack collapsed. The principle extended far beyond business conflicts into every area of human interaction. Political opponents could not damage those who refused to engage in mudslinging. Social rivals could not embarrass those who were genuinely secure in themselves. Bullies could not intimidate those who were truly unafraid of their disapproval or retaliation. Marcus began to understand that this invulnerability was not just personally beneficial, but also socially valuable. When enough individuals operated from genuine strength rather than defensive weakness, the entire community became more civilized and productive. Conflicts could be resolved through reason rather than force. Competition could focus on excellence rather than destruction. and cooperation became possible even between natural rivals. As he entered the third phase of his development, Marcus began to see his personal transformation as part of a larger mission to demonstrate alternative ways of engaging with the world. He realized that his example could inspire others to undertake their own journeys of self-mastery, creating ripple effects that might eventually transform the culture of Athens itself. This vision required Marcus to move beyond merely protecting himself from manipulation and conflict toward actively creating conditions where others could discover their own strength and wisdom. He began to serve as a mentor to younger merchants and craftsmen, not by lecturing them about his methods, but by demonstrating through his actions what was possible when someone operated from genuine self-confidence rather than ego-driven neediness. The mentoring relationships that developed were unlike the traditional master-apprentice arrangements common in Athenian society. Marcus did not seek to create copies of himself or to impose his specific approaches on others. Instead, he helped each individual identify their own patterns of weakness and develop their own strategies for overcoming them. He understood that each person's journey towards strength would be unique, shaped by their particular fears, desires, and circumstances. The merchant who was driven by an excessive need for approval would require different practices from one who was paralyzed by fear of failure. The craftsman whose weakness lay in perfectionist procrastination needed different tools from one whose problem was impulsive decision-making. What remained consistent across all these relationships was Marcus's commitment to helping others discover their authentic power, rather than teaching them to perform strength they did not genuinely possess. He could quickly identify when someone was mimicking his techniques without understanding their foundation, and he would gently guide them back toward genuine self-examination and growth. The results of this approach were remarkable. Several of his mentees went on to achieve extraordinary success in their own fields, but more importantly, they developed the kind of unshakable inner confidence that allowed them to weather any external storm. They became people who could not be easily manipulated, intimidated, or corrupted because they had learned to generate their own sense of worth and direction. Marcus observed that these individuals, in turn, began to influence their own circles of family, friends, and associates. The qualities of genuine strength, calmness under pressure, clarity of thought, integrity in action, were naturally attractive and inspiring to others. People were drawn to those who seemed truly free from the anxieties and insecurities that plagued most of human society. Gradually, a network began to emerge throughout Athens of individuals who shared a commitment to operating from authentic strength rather than defensive weakness. They were not organized as a formal group or movement, but rather connected by their common approach to life's challenges and opportunities. They supported each other's businesses, sought each other's counsel during difficult times, and collaborated on projects that benefited the broader community. This network became a stabilizing influence during the political upheavals and economic uncertainties that periodically swept through the ancient world. While others panicked in response to changing circumstances, these individuals remained centered and clear-thinking, able to adapt their strategies without abandoning their principles. Their calm confidence helped to reassure broader segments of society and prevented many potential conflicts from escalating into violence. Marcus recognized that this was perhaps the ultimate expression of the power he had been developing throughout his journey. By transforming himself, he had created the capacity to positively influence others. By helping others find their own strength, he had contributed to the development of a more stable and prosperous community. The personal had become political in the deepest sense, as individual transformation had led to social change. The influence of Marcus's example eventually reached beyond the merchant class to touch the lives of politicians, philosophers, and even military leaders. Generals began to incorporate his principles of strategic silence into their command styles, finding that measured restraint in their communications made their rare orders carry more weight with their troops. Politicians discovered that listening more than speaking allowed them to better understand the true concerns of their constituents and craft more effective policies. Even in the philosophical schools, where verbal debate had long been the primary method of exploring ideas, some thinkers began to experiment with the power of contemplative silence and strategic questioning. They found that allowing longer pauses in discussions often led to deeper insights, and that the pressure to constantly formulate clever responses had sometimes prevented them from truly hearing and considering others' perspectives. The transformation that had begun with one man's recognition of his own weaknesses had grown into a subtle but significant shift in Athenian culture itself. The change was not dramatic or sudden. There were no proclamations or institutional reforms, but rather a gradual evolution in how people related to each other and approached common challenges. Years passed, and Marcus aged from a young man seeking to prove himself into a respected elder whose wisdom was sought throughout the Mediterranean world. Merchants from Egypt, philosophers from Alexandria, and politicians from Rome made pilgrimages to Athens specifically to meet with him and learn from his approach to life and business. Yet even as his fame spread, Marcus remained committed to the principles that had guided his transformation. He continued to live simply, to speak sparingly, and to prioritize substance over appearance. The weak self that had once craved recognition and validation had been so thoroughly destroyed that external acclaim neither intoxicated him nor changed his behavior. Visitors who expected to meet a dramatic figure, perhaps a commanding orator or an intimidating presence, were often initially disappointed by Marcus's modest demeanor and quiet manner. Only through extended interaction did they begin to appreciate the depth of his insight and the solidity of his character. This itself became part of his teaching. That true strength rarely announced itself loudly, but revealed itself through consistency, reliability, and wisdom. As Marcus reflected on his journey during his later years, he recognized that the process of destroying his weak self and developing strategic wisdom had been not just personally beneficial, but had served a larger purpose in demonstrating what human beings were capable of achieving when they committed themselves to genuine growth and self-mastery. The man who had once been driven by neediness, insecurity, and the desperate desire for others' approval had become someone who could not be shaken by external circumstances, manipulated by others' emotional appeals, or corrupted by offers of power or wealth. He had achieved a form of freedom that few people ever experienced, the freedom that came from needing nothing from others that he could not provide for himself. This freedom was not isolation or indifference to others, but rather the foundation for genuine service and leadership. Because he did not need others to validate his worth, he could interact with them honestly and helpfully. Because he was not driven by personal insecurities, he could focus on what was truly best for any situation, rather than what would make him look good or feel better about himself. The strategic use of silence had been just the beginning of this transformation, a tool that had helped him recognize and change deeper patterns of thought and behavior. The real accomplishment was the development of a character so solid and centered that it could weather any storm and provide guidance and stability to others who were still struggling with their own weaknesses and fears. In his final years, Marcus would often sit in the same marketplace where he had first observed Sophron's demonstration of quiet confidence. The agora had changed over the decades, but the fundamental dynamics of human nature remained constant. He could still see the Dionysus types, loud, desperate for attention, trying to force their way to success through volume and aggression. And he could identify the emerging Sophrons, those who were learning to let their work speak for itself and to find strength in stillness rather than noise. To the very end, Marcus remained a student of human nature and a practitioner of the principles he had discovered. He never stopped learning, never stopped growing, never stopped finding new applications for the insights that had transformed his life. The journey that had begun with the simple recognition of his own weaknesses had evolved into a lifetime of service to others and contribution to the betterment of society. The document of his life stood as testimony to a profound truth that seemed paradoxical but proved itself repeatedly through experience. The person who could destroy their own weak self became truly indestructible to others, not because they were hardened or armored against the world, but because they had found within themselves everything they truly needed to live with dignity, purpose, and effectiveness. Marcus's legacy was not in any formal teachings or written philosophy, but in the countless lives he had touched and transformed through his example. Each person who learned to find their own authentic strength rather than performing borrowed confidence carried forward his influence. Each individual who chose strategic wisdom over emotional reaction helped to create a more rational and peaceful world. The ripples of his transformation continued long after his death, as those he had mentored went on to mentor others, and the principles he had embodied were passed down through generations of merchants, leaders, and ordinary citizens who had learned that there was a better way to live than in constant fear and desperate seeking of external validation. The man who had destroyed his weak self through patience, wisdom, and strategic understanding had indeed become indestructible. Not in the physical sense, but in the deeper sense that his influence and example could not be erased by time, opposition, or the changing circumstances of the world. He had achieved the only form of immortality available to human beings, the immortality of positive influencer that continues to shape lives long after the influencer has departed from the physical world. In the end, the greatest victory was not over any external opponent, but over the internal weaknesses that had once made him vulnerable to manipulation, corruption, and defeat. By winning this internal battle completely and definitively, Marcus had created the foundation for every external success that followed. The strategy that had begun with learning when to remain silent had culminated in a life of authentic power and meaningful contribution to the world. The document thus stands complete, a testament to the possibility of human transformation and the power that becomes available to those who are willing to undertake the difficult work of destroying their own weaknesses in order to build unshakable strength. Through silence and strategy, through patience and wisdom, through the gradual but complete transformation of character, any person can achieve the same indestructibility that Marcus discovered, becoming someone who cannot be defeated by others because they have already conquered themselves.